Okay, great. So just a brief introduction on the theme of how do we ensure that informal and marginalized groups are recognized in disaster response. The research that's going to be presented today has emerged obviously out of the context of the COVID pandemic, started within the context of the pandemic with the core, the COVID response COVID Responses for Equity program funded by IDRC. And we're going to share learning from our three panelists. We've got Florencia Coda, the coordinator of Colaboralat at Asuntos del Sur in Buenos Aires. We've got Aditi Vyas, the assistant director of the Gender, Youth and Development for the International Center for Research on Women. And we've also got Erick, Coyoy, the project coordinator and economist from the Asociación de Investigación, Estudios Sociales in Guatemala. Before I hand over to our panelists to hear their presentations, I'm going to just pass you to Adrian De Giovanni, who's going to give a brief welcome and introduction, then on to my colleague Jessica Mika, who will give you an overview of the key issues guides that we have developed that brings together the learnings from this research of the three panelists and other programs in core. So then we will hear from our panelists, and then we will go into the sort of breakout group format, options for both English and Spanish, before coming back together in a plenary with a chance to sort of have a conversation, reflect on how this all adds up, and really thinking about, you know, what the implications are as we look ahead into the future. So handing over to you now, Adrian.
Thanks, Louise, and welcome to everyone. Bienvenue a toutes et tous, bienvenidos a todos y todos. Just going to say a few words of introduction and welcome today. And what I'll start by doing is start with a newer custom in Canada that we have now and in other countries I've seen now in the colonial, post-colonial world, which is to start with a land acknowledgement. And I'm sitting here today in Ottawa, Canada, which is where IDRC is headquartered. And really, the lands that we sit on are the traditional lands of the Indigenous peoples, who are the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples. And they were here for centuries, decades, years, and then their lands were never formally ceded or surrendered to the British and even the French before as colonial leaders. And so we start our sessions like this always by recognizing this fact in our history. It's a part of Canada's efforts, larger efforts, or efforts within Canada working towards reconciliation. It's a long journey, and just what it really causes us to do is to reflect where we are in this moment within a larger trajectory from the past and going forward to the future, which is quite relevant, I think, for our session. More specifically, this summer, which is now starting now in Canada in earnest, has been like none other I've ever experienced, and many people have said the same thing. We've had smoke in the air. The weather forecast has been smoke, and that's from wildfires that are across the country. And it's really been a reminder and hopefully a call to action that we haven't done enough in preserving the natural environment that we live on, the lands precisely that we're on, for future generation. It's a Canadian experience, but one that we share across the world. It also foregrounds our discussion about future crises, which I'll get to, or current crises that I'll get to in a moment, that have kind of coincided and with the COVID pandemic as a public health crisis. So, and that takes us to our discussion today, which is really to talk about some of the first sets of findings from the core initiative, which is also a moment of reflection for us, because exactly 3 years ago, I was sitting right where I am, which is in my basement, and we were just finalizing the approvals and of all these wonderful COVID projects. There's been over 20 projects in 42 countries. And CORE, for those of you who are newer to it, is the COVID-19 Responses for Equity. And when the pandemic hit, which was more in March 2020, IDRC saw this opportunity. It was right as we were going into our financial year, a budget year, to say, we need to respond to the pandemic. We need to understand what the pandemic is and what's the impact going to be on societies around the world, especially in terms of the socioeconomic impacts. And we really wanted to know what's happening, and then how can many of our existing partners around the world address some of what we feared would be longer term impacts. And so what the core initiative has done through the research, and again, all these many projects around the world, is to expose the fragility, the inadequacy, and the injustice that marginalized groups, including women, gender diverse identities, migrants, among others, have faced around the world. And it's been exacerbated by additional conflicts and emergencies that we're facing in real time. And personally, in my work at IURC, I've worked a lot with different groups in informal settlements around the world, and it was really a kind of mixed story. On the one hand, where the existing exclusions and fragility of people's lives were laid bare so clearly and starkly, but on the flip side, we saw really the potential and resilience, not just of communities, but then also of organizations supporting them in informal settlements through informal situations of informality, but also in terms of potential responses. And so today we have three groups who are going to talk about some of these, what we think are fairly powerful findings and solutions identified through the core research. So I'm going to read now just to be a bit more clear and systematic. The first one will be Asuntos del Sur, and their research demonstrated the crucial role of grassroots organizations in public crisis responses. Mortality rates were significantly lower in Bolivia, Guatemala, Honduras, Uruguay, and Venezuela on average, when social organizations collaborated with national governments on detection, compared to other Latin American countries where there was no collaboration between local governments and non-governmental organizations. So this illustrates the importance of localized responses and the need to coordinate the efforts of informal community groups. It's the hard-fought lessons we've learned on participatory approaches to policy, to development. Alongside that, we're going to hear from the International Center for Research on Women, ICRW, and they were looking at women's disproportionate share of unpaid care and responsibilities that increased significantly due to school and daycare closures in countries around the world. There was heightened elder care, disability care needs, all this caused by the lockdown and disruptions. There's a huge gendered impact that played out very much in terms of care in societies across the world. As a result, women were forced to reduce their work hours or drop out of the labor force entirely to meet their care demands. And so the ICRW will be speaking about their research, which sheds light on this acute situation, and they'll explain how women were the first to lose out and the last to return to work. And then finally, we're going to hear from the Asociación de Investigación y Estudios Sociales, ASIES, who are working in the Central America's Northern Triangle, working with migrants and to help build awareness about the challenges that migrants experience when returning to their countries of origin during the pandemic. So if you remember, people were essentially thrown out of countries, especially where they were migrant workers and had to return home. The evidence helped to shift the gender and inclusion perspectives of the targeted policymakers as they established actions to integrate migrants. So they were able to come in at a very timely moment to make sure that this issue of returning migrants was on the radar of policymakers. And so just to finish off my remarks, this is right now, and I alluded to climate crisis, there's a series of other crises going on around the world right now, whether in terms of the recovery, the public health emergency and crisis in a sense has abated for COVID. 3 years ago, I mentioned I was in the basement sitting alone. Maybe I saw a colleague social distance from across the street. Yesterday, I went into work. I sat in a room with colleagues, and then I went to a swim class with my kids, and we're all indoors. And it struck me, we're at a different moment in time. But in terms of the longer term social and economic impacts, in terms of inequality, debt and inflation, livelihoods, and the recovery for people who were thrown out of the labor market during the pandemic, climate, different levels of political and insecurity and fragility, the recovery is slow, and there's new crises that are intersecting all the time. And so on the one hand, it's a moment to celebrate all our findings from CORE, because we think there's a huge set of findings to address the current set of challenges, which may not be articulated in terms of precisely in terms of COVID anymore. But on the flip side, it's also in case of future emergencies come, we have a good roadmap. The one note of caution I'll leave everyone with, I lived through the pandemic that didn't happen. 20 years ago, it was SARS. It was in Toronto, Canada, parts of Asia and Hong Kong. And it didn't become a pandemic, and everyone was lucky. And in Canada, there were huge reports written about how to avoid this the next time. When COVID hit, we realized no one had followed any of the recommendations. And so it's, on one hand, a moment of celebration, a wonderful and a powerful body of evidence we've developed. But on the flip side, this existential question we have at IDRC, how to take important evidence and findings and solutions and ensure that they're used in policy, that remains as urgent as ever. So I'll end there. Thank you, everyone, for your time over the last few years, for the research partners who are here, but also for coming today. And over to Jessica to give an overview of the key findings from the guide. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. I'm going to quickly share my screen. And hopefully you can all see that. Oh, no. All good. Just to say,
not the presentation. Oh, there you go.
They're really timely in cutting the grass outside my window of my office today, and my headset's not working. So I'm hoping that it will be quiet enough that you can all hear me okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Jessica Meeker, a knowledge manager at IDS, and I'm just going to give a really quick 5-minute overview of the key issues guide on informality and marginalised groups in crisis response that you should have all received as an attachment and a link in your invitation. And I think Emily is hoping to pop the link into the chat at the moment. Essentially, this guide was developed as a rapid literature review that aims to provide some initial insights into the emerging lessons on informality and marginalised groups in the wake of the pandemic, with a special attention to the research that's generated by core research partners, but also drawing on the perspectives from the broader literature and some of the lessons and kind of contextualising it within that. So it's not a big systematic review, it was kind of a rapid review, but drawing out some of those key lessons and insights. So what are they? I mean, it's become abundantly clear throughout the pandemic that the effects have not been evenly distributed and have exacerbated existing societal inequalities and marginalisation. And amongst those hardest hit by both the health and the secondary impacts are those living in informal settlements, often working in the informal sector, undocumented migrants and other marginalised groups like gender, race, religion, for example. And these are often also intersectional. So, for example, you often find that migrants are more likely to live in informal settlements and work in the informal sector in insecure jobs, which further adds in to their vulnerability, so kind of that multiplier effect. So what were some of the key issues that came out from the literature review? So pre-existing vulnerabilities of informal workers and marginalised groups made the impacts of COVID responses particularly severe. Those in the informal sector were unduly impacted by the cascading secondary effects of the pandemic. Although at the same time, a lot of communities depended on informal actors and networks. So for example, in Sri Lanka, where I was recently, the formal food vendors like supermarkets were shut during lockdowns. I think this happened in a lot of settings. And households actually relied on the informal cart vendors for their food supply. So often in times, these informal networks were keeping communities going. The specific impacts on informal workers, most informal workers can't work remotely, for example, and suffered a sudden drop in earnings when the pandemic hit and travel restrictions and lockdowns were instigated, often compounded by a lack of social safety net coverage and eroding of assets through some negative coping strategies. Women in particular, disproportionately affected due to things like care burden, an increase in gender-based violence, a lack of access to social and reproductive health services. And post-pandemic, recovery has been pretty slow for many in the informal sector, and the impacts haven't been evenly felt. So, for example, the Wyego study that looked across 10 cities and 3 continents found that a year on after COVID measures were introduced, 40% of domestic workers, waste pickers, and street vendors still earning 75% less than they had been before COVID. So not catching up and not recovering as quick as those in the more formal sector. Social protection often didn't reach informal workers and marginalised groups. In many countries, informal workers earn above the base threshold for targeted poverty relief, but too little to participate in contributory social protection and insurance programs, often referred to as that missing middle. And additionally, a lot of social protection responses were digitized, and those digital approaches often excluded marginalised groups who may lack digital access, or maybe the necessary documentation or a bank account, for example. And then data issues. One of the biggest challenges in the management of the pandemic in many countries was the lack of robust, timely, disaggregated data on marginalised groups and informal workers, and particularly seen with internal migration. So what are some of the emerging lessons, particularly in light of what Adrian was just saying about really learning from this pandemic? Something that came through was to identify the cascading and often unexpected effects of restricted measures. As we've seen, restrictions like lockdowns and school closures and travel restrictions often led to negative multiplier effects, which exposed and exacerbated the underlying vulnerabilities of these groups. And interventions have been seen to be more effective when they're considered against those interconnected vulnerabilities to help anticipate the possible cascading effects. Carefully considering patterns of exclusion and inclusion in the disaster relief measures. Vulnerable informal sector workers, particularly migrants, were likely to remain excluded from schemes that emerged in response to the pandemic, which typically adopted models that were more likely to cater for salaried or formal workers. So schemes need to be extended to those who are commonly excluded by both poverty and employment-based protections, so those who are falling through the cracks. Includes pre-filling existing gaps in the coverage, improving the portability of social protection schemes to avoid excluding large numbers of the most vulnerable, and migrant-specific difficulties such as registration outside of cities and their limited social and institutional networks should be included in the design of relief measures. Identify, support and legitimize the role of grassroots organizations in public crisis response. Much of the core research and beyond has highlighted the importance of localized responses, which is no surprise. And it's critical that the roles of civil society and grassroots organizations can play are recognized and factored into those response and recovery plans, as these organizations are often most able to reach informal workers and those living in the living or working in the informal sector through long-term engagement and relationships, and really critically through trusted relationships. They've built trust over time. Collaboration really is key. The need to coordinate these efforts of those informal community groups, CSOs, with local and national governments came through really strongly. Grassroots and CSOs were key throughout the pandemic, often in extending government services in many hard-to-reach communities, including informal settlements. And we saw from the Collabora-LAT study that COVID infection rates were significantly lower on average when social organizations collaborated together with national governments on detection and vaccine distribution. But at the same time, we need to ensure that it doesn't nullify the government's responsibility for that last mile delivery. And then finally on data, improved data availability and particularly disaggregated data, including gender disaggregation. And so for effective future responses to disasters and crises, there's a need for robust gender disaggregated data on marginalized groups to ensure that the relief really does reach those most in need. And it's so important, just reflecting on what Adrian said, that we really capture this learning and take it forward. And in particular, better understand how informality affects these policy responses to help design more grounded and contextualized responses to future crises. And so we're going to move on to hear from the three core projects who've just been introduced, which look at informality and marginalised groups from three quite different perspectives. Before we do so, we're not going to open up in between each presentation to a Q&A, but we are going to ask you to capture, well, I can stop sharing my screen, to capture your initial thoughts and reactions in a collective word cloud. So at the end of each presentation, we'll invite you to click on this link and pop one or two words of something that really struck you from each presentation, something that, something that you've learned that's new or surprised you, or just the kind of key takeaway. And then over the three presentations, we'll generate this collaborative word cloud, just to give us a sense of kind of the main themes and things that are coming through and sticking in people's minds. And we'll reflect back on that at the end when we come back into plenary. But Louise, I'll hand back over to you, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our three panelists.
Great, thank you very much, Jess and Adrian, for that welcome and sort of really insightful overview of some of the issues that have emerged on informality around the pandemic, and sort of now really excited to have a bit more of a deeper dive into the three perspectives coming through from each of the projects. Before we move to that, a few people have come in late, so I've just been nudged by the team to point you once again to the interpretation button at the bottom of the sort of panel at the bottom. It sort of looks like a globe, and there, just to check you're in the right language, we have parallel English, Spanish and French, and we are going to have two presenters presenting in Spanish. So for those of you who joined late, please make your way there if you are not fluent Spanish speakers. And I have great pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Florencia Coda, who is the coordinator of Colaboralat. She has stepped in at the last minute to present for her team member who's unfortunately unable to make it. So we really appreciate having Florencia here. We know that she's worked sort of on the ground throughout this research project, so she's really well placed to share the insights and lessons, and she's got the unenviable task of trying to share those with us in the next 8 minutes. So Florencia, have we got your slides? You've got over to you.
Bueno, hola a todos, muchas gracias, Luis. Espero que me escuchen bien. Cualquier inconveniente, por favor, me avisan durante la presentación. Paso a compartir. Espero que estén viendo bien la pantalla. Sí.
Yeah.
Perfecto. En estos 8 minutos les quiero hablar sobre cuáles son los objetivos del proyecto Colaboralat en relación a cómo se investigó junto con grupos en situaciones de vulnerabilidad, grupos marginalizados, qué fue lo que hallamos en función de esto y cuáles son nuestras recomendaciones de política pública para involucrar a estos grupos en las tomas de decisiones, no solamente involucrarlos, sino también involucrar sus perspectivas y sus miradas, porque qué es lo que considera el proyecto y qué es lo que principalmente la guía del proyecto es que para hacer política pública es necesaria la perspectiva de todos los grupos, justamente porque construye mejor democracia. Entonces, la perspectiva del proyecto es sentar las bases para una mejor democracia, específicamente en América Latina. Bueno, entonces, el proyecto se centra en 3 objetivos fundamentales. Uno es entender y analizar la gobernanza colaborativa como respuesta a problemas complejos. ¿Qué entendemos por gobernanza colaborativa? Son instancias entre gobierno, sociedad civil, sectores privados, sindicatos, para hacer política pública. Consideramos que la gobernanza colaborativa es fundamental para responder a problemas complejos. Problemas complejos como el COVID, como decía Adrian, que es cambio climático, como es la crisis migratoria, ¿Por qué? Bueno, porque justamente la gobernanza colaborativa tiene la capacidad de, al incluir actores en la toma de decisiones, mayor llegada a los territorios que quiere abordar la política pública. Por eso consideramos que es una muy buena herramienta para responder a esos problemas complejos. Y en tercer punto, lo que buscamos hacer desde el proyecto es entender, comprender cómo son los modelos de gobernanza colaborativa específicamente en América Latina. Hay mucha literatura sobre cómo es la gobernanza colaborativa, si quiere más en el norte global y no en el sur global, y las informalidades particulares de las instituciones de América Latina. Los formatos de gobierno son muy particulares, entonces buscamos comprender cómo suceden los modelos de gobernanza en la región. Para eso, nuestro estudio se concentra en 6 países de América Latina. México, en donde estudiamos y trabajamos junto con trabajadoras domésticas y migrantes. En Guatemala, donde trabajamos y estudiamos junto con jóvenes de distintas localidades de Guatemala. En Colombia, también junto con juventudes afrodescendientes. En Bolivia, estamos trabajando junto con trabajadoras del sector informal. En Chile, trabajamos con municipalidades, gobiernos locales con mayores niveles de vulnerabilidad. Y en Argentina también trabajamos con 4 municipios, gobiernos locales, con altos niveles de personas en situaciones de vulnerabilidad. ¿Qué es lo que encontramos principalmente? Que durante la pandemia, durante el COVID, la mayor cantidad de respuestas para este problema complejo llegó específicamente del lado de organizaciones de sociedad civil. El Estado llegó tardíamente. Por este motivo, las organizaciones de sociedad civil, los grupos marginalizados, fueron quienes más respuestas dieron a sus necesidades diarias. Entre ellas, presentamos algunos ejemplos. Sucedieron lo que se conoce como ollas comunes, que son lugares donde se distribuye comida en los barrios en forma popular. Esto sucedió en Chile con una característica muy particular de una división de género del trabajo. Quienes estaban encargadas de estas ollas comunes eran las mujeres principalmente. Las mujeres fueron quienes respondieron en mayor medida a las necesidades alimentarias básicas en los primeros momentos de pandemia. Otro ejemplo también es la Red Departamental de Niñez, Adolescencia y Juventudes en Guatemala. También fueron redes de jóvenes que frente a las necesidades empezaron a distribuir también recursos básicos sanitarios para atender a la pandemia en sus comunidades. Otro caso es de la Red de Seguimiento de Política Migratoria en México, quienes frente a las faltas de derechos humanos que se están sucediendo sobre los migrantes en México, se organizaron, formaron organizaciones de sociedad civil, una red, un formato de gobernanza colaborativa para reclamar y demandarle al Estado cumplir con las normas básicas de derechos humanos para los migrantes y las migrantes. ¿Qué problema vemos con esto? ¿Cuáles son como los principales obstáculos de este tipo de experiencias locales de colaboración? Es que no se llegan a institucionalizar, ¿no? ¿Qué pasa? Que vemos desde el proyecto que las instancias de colaboración, los formatos de colaboración que más se institucionalizan, más capacidades tienen de resolver luego el problema, porque tienen una red, una serie de normas, de reglas que les permite volver a encontrarse en el futuro, no terminar la colaboración una vez que se logra el objetivo. Por eso consideramos que la institucionalización de la colaboración es fundamental. Nuestro argumento central es que la gobernanza colaborativa es mucho más efectiva y legítima cuando el gobierno tiene relación con las comunidades en situaciones de vulnerabilidad. ¿Por qué? Porque logra llegar muchísimo más fácil al territorio. El gobierno solo, específicamente tal vez en América Latina, donde existen instituciones o instituciones de gobierno que a veces no tienen las capacidades para llegar a todo su territorio, el estar en contacto y construir la política pública en conjunto y colaborativamente con las comunidades les da muchísima más capacidad al gobierno para llegar a mayor cantidad de población. En este sentido, lo que vemos es que esto que les mencionaba recién, los modelos de gobernanza colaborativa tienen mayor capacidad de influencia, tienen también muchísima más creatividad en la política pública, mayor cantidad de recursos cuando se construye colaborativamente con otros actores. Algunos ejemplos de esto que tenemos son tres principales. El plan Detectar en Argentina, que es un plan de justamente detección de casos de COVID, donde el gobierno con organizaciones comunitarias en distintos municipios de provincias argentinas identificaban cuáles eran los casos de COVID y capacitaban a las comunidades sobre cómo prevenirlo. El Pacific Task Force en Colombia porque sigue existiendo un formato de gobernanza colaborativa con distintos actores también para, de forma multidisciplinar, capacitar a las comunidades sobre cómo atender el COVID y evitar la mayor cantidad de contagios. Centinela Renca sucedió en Chile, es un esfuerzo de gobierno local con también organizaciones de sociedad civil de base para divisar cuáles son los casos de COVID en el territorio. Esto fue muy interesante porque fue un ejemplo de éxito que se replicó en otros gobiernos locales. Entonces, ¿qué es lo que hallamos en uno de nuestros trabajos particulares? Es que cuando el gobierno...
Florencia, un minuto más, por favor.
Perfecto, ya cierro entonces.
Yeah.
Cuando el gobierno trabajó en conjunto colaborativamente con organizaciones de sociedad civil y organizaciones privadas, los resultados de los casos de COVID fueron muchísimo menores. ¿Sí? Les dejo ahí la fuente también para que puedan revisar el trabajo. Muchas gracias, Luis.
Thank you, Florencia. It's the horrible task of the moderator to have to interrupt. So I'm going to pass very straight away over to Aditi Vyas from the International Center for Research on Women. Aditi, the floor is yours. You have 8 minutes.
Great. Thanks, Louise. And Laurie is going to share my screen for me. Thank you so much, Laurie. Just before we dive in, the project seeks to understand the effects of socioeconomic policy responses because of the COVID-19 pandemic on the informal women workers, specifically street vendors and domestic workers. The project had 3 phases. We have all the products from the different phases up on our website. The QR code you see on the screen below, if you scan that, it will take you to the landing page for Rebuild. Okay, very quickly moving on. So today, I'm just going to very quickly talk about, Laurie, you can go to the next slide. Yeah, the primary research study, which was with domestic workers, women domestic workers and street vendors in India. The study was carried out in Delhi NCR, which is Delhi and the neighboring areas of which comes as part of the National Capital Region. We surveyed 1,500 domestic workers and street vendors, conducted 50 in-depth interviews and 11 key informant interviews with subject matter experts, policy practitioners, and government representatives. Going forward, I'm just going to quickly move into the key findings. Thanks, Laurie. The key findings are divided into 2 sections. First, we want to talk about what is this context of informality. When we say informal women workers, what do we really mean? And then we dive into the specific pandemic-induced vulnerabilities which were exacerbated because of the pandemic and other responses. So moving on, Laurie, can we go to the next slide? Yeah, for the next slide. In terms of the context of informality, next slide, please. We found that overall, the street vendors and domestic workers, the distribution was similar across the geographical regions of Delhi NCR and also between street vendors and domestic workers. 49 respondents had no schooling, and this is extremely crucial because no schooling or low schooling and early marriage and other factors such as having no skilling are actually responsible for concentrating women into low-paying, low-skilled jobs such as domestic work and street vending. 81% of the respondents were married, and most of them said that they were married before the age of 20. 85% of these women are either chief or sole wage earners. That means they are either the only contributing member or the chief contributing member to the financial contributions of the household. 30% do not use a mobile phone. This is extremely crucial because in a day and age when we are talking about linking services via various platforms, digital access, 30% women, street vendors, domestic workers were not using mobile phones. The distribution was 75% of domestic workers and 65% of street vendors, which also limits their access to other things such as digital payments. Can we move to the next slide, please? We found that the informal women workers, domestic workers, and street vendors had very limited access to government schemes, also on account of the identity documents that they possess. So while almost everybody in the sample had an Aadhaar card, which is the main identifiable document for India, only not a majority, 44% did not have a ration card, which allows you to access the public distribution system of free food grains, which was another scheme that was launched during the pandemic for people to be able to access food relief. But we found in our study that women were not able to do that because they were asked to present their ration cards at times of free food distribution during and also suffered other barriers such as long queues, just waiting for long hours, accessibility issues and such. Can we move forward, please? In terms of pandemic-induced vulnerabilities, when we go forward, we found that, Rolly, we can go to the next slide, please. Majority experienced loss of income and loss of employment. Like Adrian said in his introductory note, these were the women who couldn't, and I think Louis also mentioned it, they couldn't work from home. So either they were fired or they experienced loss of income. 94% ended up using their savings for, just meeting household expenses. Also, all of this is very also crucial to understand that as it is because on account of the gender and the fact that in India, social norms dictate that women are the ones who are primarily responsible for household work, domestic work, as is women, domestic workers and street vendors are able to only choose their hours of work and the kind of work they're able to take up depending on the household responsibility. So that means domestic workers work in the fewer number of houses depending on how they can manage their household responsibilities. And similarly, street vendors and domestic workers both choose the hours they can work. All of this totally changed during the pandemic. They had to borrow money for living expenses. Only 6% borrowed from formal institutions such as bank. And this becomes very crucial because there's also this sense of distrust with the formal banking institutions and lack of concrete linkages that allows that access of women to really seek out formal loan possible systems. There was shortage of ration and cooking fuel that was experienced during the first lockdown. We also found in our study that women are the ones who sort of cut down on their own nutrition so as to be able to ensure that the families are eating, their children are eating. And as a result of the pandemic, most respondents are still severely in debt, whether in terms of being able to pay their rents, being able to sort of pay back the loans that they took during the pandemic. And as we know, in terms of the context of informality, these women are the ones who not only themselves are in formal occupations, but even their family members, whether it is their husbands or other members, are in other similar informal occupations, construction, daily wage work, either domestic work or street vending. And they also reside in informal settlements. That means areas of cities which are marred by poor urban infrastructure, lack of access to adequate transport and water and things like that. Can we move on, please? In terms of access to sexual and reproductive health services, we found that women expressed low need for access to pregnancy-related services during the survey. And out of the ones who did express that need, only 20% were able to access them. So there were barriers there as well. In the qualitative interviews, we found that There were challenges women faced in accessing prenatal, delivery, and postnatal services. The fact that there was a national lockdown, the COVID response was really managed by all the hospitals and the government institutions. So they really had very little options as to where to seek care when it came to pregnancy and delivery services. Some had to opt for private hospitals, which meant either taking loans or really going into debt, or in some cases even facing complications. Can we go forward, please? In terms of experience of violence, the whole violence is something that is normalized as part of their lives. It was not something that happened only during the pandemic. It might have heightened in some cases. And also we saw there's a sense of normalization of violence, that, there's a reason, if I don't make a mistake, my husband will not hit me. He's hitting me because, he's stressed. He doesn't have a job. We don't have money to feed our children. These are the arguments we heard. There was also a resistance in being able to report violence for the fear of stigma. Just overall, what will the society talk about? How will people react? Fear of further violence. What will my husband do? What will their extended family say? And similar things we also heard vis-a-vis experience of violence in public spaces, because women street vendors found it much harder to sort of sell their goods in secret during the pandemic, while some were declared as national and essential workers because they were selling fruits and vegetables. Others who were selling non-essential items such as bags, clothing, pots, etc., they were always fearing the harassment by police, MCD authorities, municipal corporation authorities, and others. And they also feared violence in terms of public spaces, in terms of being able to put up the cards and whether they'll be asked to vacate it at the last minute's notice. Moving on.
Okay, sorry, Aditi, it's your 1 minute call, please. So
okay, great.
Start wrapping.
Great,
thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Louise. We found that the access to health services, access to government schemes, while the food grain access was the one which most people were able to really avail, 1/3 still did not access any government schemes, whether it was direct cash transfer or food grains. Moving on. We also found, just in terms of overall mental health, we found that women did report severe depression and other issues of mental health on the account that they had lost jobs and they were worried about how are they going to sustain their households. In terms of key recommendations, there are few recommendations we want to make in case a crisis of this nature appears again, or just in terms of being able to strengthen the current systems to ensure that these workers are brought within the ambit of formal laws. Laurie, can we move ahead? So we are talking about just being able to bring informal women workers and give them the social security benefits that they deserve. The eShram portal, it's an online portal that the government has recently introduced. We want to ensure that the linkages are facilitated on that, so the workers are registered. They can claim benefits such as having the unique ID number, having accidental insurance, handicap insurance, etc. We also want to ensure that grassroots organizations, something my previous colleague spoke about in terms of collaborations, be able to work with grassroots organizations, sensitizing them, their frontline workers, to the varying needs of women informal workers. That is something we really want to sort of focus on. Moving on, just in terms of the last bit, advocating for safer public spaces for women street vendors, which are well lit, have hygiene facilities, have water, ensuring inclusive and urban infrastructure for the poor, and really strengthening the linkages to all government entitlements, including identification documents, other documents that may be required to ensure that the informal women workers are able to access the schemes and benefits that are currently there for Social Security. Thank you so much. Apologies if I went over time. Over to you, Louise.
Brilliant. Thank you, Aditi. There's so much there. I think you did a brilliant job. It's such a challenge and I feel so mean. Before passing over to our final panelists today, and look at the claps coming in for you there, just pointing all of your attention back to the word cloud. It's starting to take shape, just a space to capture any sort of headline impressions. And with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Erick Coyoy from Asociación. Over to you, Erick.
Gracias. Yo voy a hablar un poco sobre la respuesta del Estado durante la pandemia para atender a la población marginada. Incluye en general a toda la población, tanto la población migrante que transita por Guatemala. Guatemala se ha convertido en un corredor de tránsito de migrantes hacia los Estados Unidos, de tal manera que es abundante la cantidad de población, de habitantes de otros países que tienen que sobrevivir en estas condiciones en Guatemala. Y también ilustrar algunos casos de cómo esta respuesta del Estado es totalmente insuficiente. En Guatemala la marginalidad es un problema que afecta a la mayoría de población trabajadora. 70% del empleo a nivel nacional se ubica en el sector informal, solo un 30% en el sector formal. Esta informalidad afecta mucho más a la población rural, casi un 80%. Pueden ver aquí ustedes una serie histórica de 2002 a 2022, 20 años en que la informalidad rural se ha mantenido cerca del 80%, que es la línea superior hasta arriba. Mientras que en el área urbana metropolitana la situación es menos complicada, entre un 40 y 50% de la población ocupada del área metropolitana trabaja en informalidad. Tenemos este problema entonces de que el sector formal se concentra principalmente en el área urbana metropolitana y con ello también tenemos una concentración de red de servicios públicos en este sector del país. En Guatemala el sector informal genera el 21% del PIB cada año. Es decir, vemos, esto da lugar entonces a una situación de baja productividad de esta población que tiene que elaborar en estas actividades de subsistencia y con ello se tiene que predominan los bajos ingresos. El ingreso promedio del trabajador informal es casi la mitad del salario mínimo legal para el sector formal. ¿Qué hizo el Estado en Guatemala para atender a la población marginada del sector informal? Y esto incluye también a la población migrante que está en tránsito en busca de los Estados Unidos, como también a la población retornada que es deportada de los Estados Unidos. No hubo desde el Estado una respuesta específica para esta población retornada, sino fueron incluidos dentro del mismo paquete oficial de asistencia. Se implementó un programa de transferencias monetarias condicionadas llamado Bono Familia para atender a aquella población que perdió sus ingresos debido a la crisis. Debido al confinamiento, todas las actividades informales fueron suspendidas y esto ocasionó que toda esta mayoría de trabajadores perdiera sus ingresos automáticamente de un día para otro. La condición para recibir el beneficio era tener un bajo ingreso, pero no se cuenta con un registro de beneficiarios que permite identificar a esta población. Se hizo uso del registro de consumo de energía eléctrica para identificar aquellos hogares de bajo consumo de energía y se supone que son los hogares de bajo ingreso. Esto tuvo una severa limitante y es que la población rural más marginada no tiene electricidad, de tal manera que no tuvieron la posibilidad de quedar incluidos en el registro de beneficiarios de esta asistencia durante la pandemia. Ahí es donde entraron a jugar su rol activo muchas organizaciones sociales, sobre todo comunitarias y rurales, que brindaron alguna asistencia alimentaria y sanitaria a la población que no fue atendida por el Estado por no tener energía eléctrica en su hogar. La asistencia fue de un alcance realmente limitado. Se distribuyeron 6.000 millones de quetzales, unos 770 millones de dólares, a un total de 2.7 millones de hogares beneficiarios. En Guatemala en total son unos 4 millones de hogares los que existen y la mayoría, más de 2 millones, 2.7 millones fueron atendidos por este programa porque son los que pudieron demostrar un bajo consumo de energía eléctrica. El beneficio promedio entregado fue de $285 para cada hogar beneficiario. Esto es equivalente al salario mínimo de un mes. Y esto fue la única asistencia otorgada de manera directa a los hogares más afectados y, como ya lo decía, la gran limitante fue que los más marginados, los que carecen de electricidad, no tuvieron acceso a este beneficio. Este programa fue evaluado por UNICEF y esta sistematización la pueden consultar ustedes en este enlace. Guatemala es un país de ingreso medio alto, de acuerdo con la clasificación del Banco Mundial. Sin embargo, prevalecen muchas brechas de desigualdad, especialmente aquellas relativas al ingreso. Y el acceso a los servicios de educación y salud también está muy afectado por estas brechas. Las poblaciones de más bajo ingreso son las poblaciones rurales, indígenas, y las más bajas coberturas de servicios públicos afectan a estas poblaciones. También es muy amplia la brecha digital. Para la mayoría no hay acceso a tecnologías de información y comunicación. Casi toda la población tiene un teléfono móvil, pero solo un 20% de la población tiene acceso a Internet. Otro gran problema de Guatemala es la brecha de género. La mitad de las mujeres no participan en el mercado laboral. Se dedican principalmente al trabajo doméstico no remunerado y esto las hace carecer de un ingreso propio. Estas brechas afectan principalmente a la población rural e indígena. Esta población es más del 40% del total de la población del país, es decir que el problema acá es de magnitud. Las organizaciones sociales sí cumplieron un rol muy activo para atender localmente a sus comunidades, pero el problema es que casi la mitad de la población del país se encuentra en esta situación de marginación.
Un minuto más, por favor.
Aquí tenemos el bajo nivel de capital humano de Guatemala, es el más bajo de América Latina. Otro problema del país es los bajos ingresos fiscales. Tenemos problemas de corrupción, pero también tenemos problemas de baja disponibilidad de ingresos fiscales. La línea hasta abajo pueden ver el círculo rojo, corresponde a Guatemala. Tiene los ingresos fiscales más bajos del mundo, incluso más bajo que el promedio de los países de ingreso bajo, a pesar de que Guatemala es un país de ingreso medio. Es decir que sí, la capacidad del Estado para dar atención a estos problemas es muy reducida, y además de eso tenemos las brechas de género y la discriminación, sobre todo a la población indígena, que todavía es muy marcada en Guatemala. Muchas gracias.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric, and to all of our panelists today. Do we have any burning questions? Just before we go into our breakout groups, we do have just a few minutes if there is anything sort of burning clarification questions, but you are going to have a chance to go into breakout groups with each of our panelists and explore this, because obviously we were at 8 minutes is very, very short. Before we go into that, just before I open the floor, can I remind you again of the word cloud to sort of try and generate a bit of a buzz around some of those sort of key messages and keywords that are coming out of this. When you go into your breakout groups, essentially, this will be a chance for you to react to the presentation, what was particularly significant from those presentations, and we're really sort of thinking about the implications for your future work, a chance to reflect in terms of what the pandemic has changed, and the areas where the learning from the pandemic is really most relevant, and how we can, what can we do about that, and how can we apply it moving forward. What have we learned? And there's like 3 really strong examples about conducting research, and really reaching those hard to reach populations. And so, looking ahead, the future research agenda, what is needed to drive change in terms of knowledge, the gaps, the strategies for policy engagements. We will be posting those questions into the chat. Each of your groups will have a moderator and a note taker. Aditi is already sort of sharing some additional information. Before I give the instructions of how to find your breakout group, would anyone like to put their hand up? Any sort of burning questions that you feel can't wait till we get into those breakout groups? Okay. All right, that is good news. Okay, because of our language selection and the sort of bilingual nature of today's webinar, we have 3 breakout groups. And you will have the opportunity to self-select. So for those of you who would like to have a chance to discuss in more detail with Florencia, she will be in breakout group 1, I believe. IDS colleagues, correct me if I'm wrong. If you would like to hear more from Aditi, she will be in breakout group 2. And for those of you who would like to talk more to Erick, you don't have to do anything. You stay in this space, and but we will not have translation in the breakout groups, I believe. So that will happen this will be happening in Spanish in this space. So we have half an hour for the breakout groups. Can I ask each of the moderators to I assume you have the questions that we can repost into the chat, and I will see you back here at, should we say, 2:35 for whoever is setting that countdown clock. Right, Laurie, can you press the magic button so that people can self-select? So option 1 for Florencia, option 2 for Aditi. It's not a popularity contest. And those of you that would like to stay and hear more from Erick's work, stay here.
Brilliant. And everybody should have received an invite to join one of the rooms.
Okay, I can see the boxes are shuffling. Yo me quedo acá con usted, Erick.
I would like to join Aditi, please.
Remind me where we see the invites.
Laurie, no invite, Laurie.
Oh. It should be at the bottom. At the bottom, there's a breakout rooms section. You should be able to click on
okay.
that.
So if you go to the 3 dots at the bottom of your, sorry, that wasn't clear. 3 dots at the bottom of the panel, and then you should have the option to join a breakout room. Sorry, that wasn't clear. I thought it would.
No, it's fine. I see only 2 there. Is that correct?
Yeah. So that's 2, and then this room will stay open for Erick.
Thanks. Yes. Thanks very much.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Ya. A ver, un minutico más. Que averiguar que los que estén aquí son los que quieren estar. Bueno, Fernando, le paso la palabra.
Muchas gracias, Luis. Muchas gracias. Y saludos a todos. Vamos a hacer la sesión en español, ¿sí? Y si pueden, creo que podemos empezar con una ronda rapidita de introducción, solo para saber quién se queda en la sala, por lo menos, porque creo que algunas personas que son intérpretes o otros de esos naturalmente no necesitan hablar, pero los que están para la discusión con Erick y conmigo para el grupo de trabajo, por favor, ¿se pueden prender la cámara? O levantar la mano, los que se quedan todavía para la discusión. así sabemos que contestamos. Conrad, te veo ahí, y Amanda, sí. Aquí. Puedo empezar yo, soy Fernando Perini, yo trabajo para IDRC, estoy en la IDRC por 15 años, estaba justo involucrado por los últimos 3 años en el equipo de Democratic Inclusive Governance, junto con Adrian y otros de IDRC, y me toca ser responsable por el proyecto con Asuntos del Sur, con Florencia, etcétera, como oficial de programas, solo para que tengan un contacto directo. Pero muy rapidito, si pueden mencionar ahí quién sigue en la sala. Conrad, solo decir el nombre de institución, solo para sabernos un poco cuánto estamos. Conrad, ¿tú sigues ahí?
Hi, Fernando, sorry. My name is Conrad Van Gas. I'm the Principal Investigating Officer for the COVID Macroeconomic Policy Responses in Africa project. I wanted to join this group because I was intrigued into your understanding of the issues of fiscal capacity and how that relates to reaching informal workers. The situation is very different between South Africa and the rest of Africa. So in South Africa, roughly 80% of the workforce is formally employed and about 20% informally employed. And generally that ratio is reversed in the rest of Africa. And so similarly, the ability of the South African government to extend welfare benefits to informal workers is feasible, whereas it's not in most of the other African countries.
Excelente punto, Conrad. Sí, efectivamente, un punto importante. Podemos retomar ese punto rápidamente, pero siguiendo un poco el round, solo saber quién sigue en la sala también. Yo vi a Amanda, tenía la mano levantada en algún momento, solo para presentarte, Amanda. ¿Sigues ahí? No. Bueno, perfecto. Perfecto, no hay problema, no te preocupes. Espero que el audio esté bueno. Y si pueden rápidamente levantar la mano solo para saber, porque yo sé que hay varias personas que son conectadas a interpretación, etc. Yo te veo ahí, Eleni, ¿sigues ahí o no? Eleni, are you there? Probablemente no. Muy bien, somos un grupo, me parece un grupo chico que quedó en esa sala, pero lo importante es la discusión y el chico más poderoso. Eso es lo más importante. Bueno, excelente. Y creo que Conrad ya empezó un poquito. Creo que la primera pregunta que tenemos acá, yo puedo poner las preguntas que son las preguntas guías para la discusión. Las puedo poner aquí en el chat, pero la primera pregunta efectivamente es un poco de reacción sobre la presentación, principalmente la presentación de Erick, pero también puede ser una reacción mismo de Erick sobre las otras presentaciones, también va bien. ¿Qué en particular te pareció importante, significativo en la presentación y que tenemos que explorar más en el futuro? Un punto ya lo mencionó Conrad, naturalmente, que es el tema de la situación fiscal de los países y su capacidad de aportar esos programas de transferencia de recursos en casos de crisis, ¿no? Y cómo eso es limitante en muchos países por sus diferentes situaciones fiscales. ¿Algún otro punto a llevar, a explorar? O quizá, si quieres reaccionar a eso ya directamente, también bienvenido.
Gracias. Sí considero que es importante tomar en cuenta los aspectos étnicos y culturales de las poblaciones. Generalmente se la situación es de emergencia y por tratar de reaccionar rápido se brindan soluciones estándar para las poblaciones y no se toman necesariamente en cuenta los aspectos culturales que influyen en la toma de decisiones de estas poblaciones, incluso la toma de decisión de aceptar o no una asistencia social o un servicio público por la modalidad en que le es entregado, que no corresponde a su patrón cultural. Esto es muy fuerte en Guatemala. Esto es muy marcado en Guatemala y debido a la amplia presencia de poblaciones indígenas, 40% de la población se autoidentifica como indígena. Y por tanto, pues es muy importante que las respuestas a estas poblaciones tomen en cuenta estos aspectos. Ha ocurrido, por ejemplo, en proyectos de asistencia alimentaria, donde les brindan alimentos que no responden a su patrón cultural y no los consumen. Los dan a los animales o los venden, pero no los consumen y por tanto no se logra el objetivo de la asistencia que se les brinda.
Muy bien, es importante punto. También lo que menciona Conrad era más también un poquito del tema de la situación fiscal, la capacidad, porque tú mencionaste específicamente los recursos limitados, menos de $300 por persona que recibe cada beneficiario durante todo el proceso de la distribución de la pandemia, ¿no? Ese valor naturalmente está conectado con la capacidad del gobierno de tener los recursos disponibles para avanzar el programa, pero de tu punto de vista, ¿cómo lo ves? ¿Eso fue mismo comparado con otros países de Centroamérica mucho abajo del padrón que recibió otros países? ¿O Guatemala podría haber hecho más? ¿Cómo lo ve, no ve esta situación, Erick?
Como sabemos, pues casi todos los países hicieron uso de la deuda pública para enfrentar esta crisis de la pandemia. Incluso ahora mismo hay países de bajo ingreso con severos problemas de deuda pública. En Guatemala fue lo mismo. Realmente con esos ingresos fiscales tan bajos no hay posibilidad para atender estos programas de emergencia con los recursos ordinarios. Se tuvo que hacer uso de la deuda. Este paquete extraordinario de asistencia fue con recursos de deuda y por tanto pues fue limitado. Este paquete este programa de bono familia fue equivalente a 1% del PIB del país, realmente bastante limitado. Sin embargo, pues en comparación con el presupuesto total sí fue alto porque es un presupuesto bajo también. Los ingresos públicos del país rondan el 10% del PIB, es decir, aumentar el gasto en un punto del PIB en Guatemala realmente es una situación bastante desafiante y sobre todo si es con deuda. Y por tanto sí es un tema que sin duda limitó la capacidad del Estado para atender. Además de las otras limitantes que ya se hablaron en los casos de Argentina e India, ¿verdad? Donde pues los mecanismos que usa el Estado no son los más apropiados para llegar a la población más marginada. Sin duda eso afectó un salario mínimo en un periodo de casi 6 meses de confinamiento. Fue absolutamente absolutamente insuficiente, sin duda. Pero la capacidad del Estado para endeudarse más fue lo que limitó que no pudiera el monto ser mayor. Sin duda, el resto de Centroamérica también tiene una situación fiscal complicada. Creo que no es un problema exclusivo de Guatemala, la situación fiscal difícil. Pero en Guatemala, pues al ser los ingresos más bajos y es la economía más grande de Centroamérica, lo que esta situación fiscal nos refleja son las brechas de desigualdad. O sea, que el gran problema de Guatemala en realidad son las brechas de desigualdad, porque es la economía más grande de Centroamérica, pero también con los ingresos fiscales más bajos de la región.
Importante. Y creo que Luis sí tiene un punto, y creo que a mí me interesa también pensar un poquito el tema de inflación y cómo esto está conectado con los temas macroeconómicos. Pero primero Luis, por favor.
Sí, bueno, quiero dejar la palabra para Conrad, pero una pregunta para el tema de la migración y cómo para mí lo que me destacó de su presentación fue la falta de visibilidad de los migrantes a la hora de volver a sus países por la necesidad de la pandemia. Y por eso, pero es como un doble desafío, porque los países centroamericanos son muy dependientes de las remesas de esos mismos migrantes, ¿no? Entonces, a ver si su estudio ha incorporado ese elemento de la pérdida de las remesas en la economía, y un poco usted introdujo el tema de la migración, pero ¿qué es el vínculo entre la parte fiscal y la parte de cómo apoyar a esa gente que al final están marginados e invisibilizados en la sociedad?
El problema en Guatemala es que la migración realmente nunca se detuvo, aún con confinamiento. Los flujos de migrantes siguieron. Se hizo más caro, se hizo más prolongado, pero realmente nunca se detuvo el flujo de migrantes. Las remesas tampoco nunca se detuvieron. Bajaron un poco, unos meses, pero realmente fue muy breve. El flujo de remesas siguió entrando al país. El año pasado las remesas fueron equivalentes al 20% del PIB nacional.
Wow.
Eso es mucho.
Comparar con el programa que usted mencionó es otro nivel, ¿no?
Absolutamente. Incluso las remesas son casi el doble de los ingresos fiscales. Es decir, sí, ya no solo los hogares marginados dependen de las remesas, sino el país mismo depende de las remesas. Las exportaciones de productos también son menores que las remesas. Es decir, ya la variable remesa en Guatemala ya adquirió un peso demasiado grande, no solo en la vida de los hogares rurales, sobre todo, e indígenas, porque los principales receptores de remesas son poblaciones rurales indígenas, sino también en la economía del país en su conjunto. El consumo nacional depende fuertemente de las remesas. Estas remesas son principalmente para consumo de los hogares, porque hay que recordar que el que migra es el trabajador y se queda la población dependiente, que depende de este ingreso de la remesa para su consumo, y por eso, pues afortunadamente tuvieron ese recurso para enfrentar la pandemia, porque si no tenían electricidad, si no cuentan con electricidad, la asistencia del gobierno no les llegó.
En general se puede decir que la verdad el impacto de la asistencia en Estados Unidos tuvo más impacto en Guatemala que el programa nacional, de cierta forma, ¿no?
Exactamente. Sin duda la asistencia económica que brindó Estados Unidos fue clave para mantener las remesas. Sin duda, eso es evidente.
¿Y qué impacto eso tiene? Que la política, digamos, el programa en Estados Unidos que tuvo el impacto más directo sobre poblaciones específicas, ¿no? Sobre remesas. ¿Por qué eso y no un programa nacional? ¿Qué impacto diferenciado tiene eso, ¿no? De que el programa de Estados Unidos que tuvo más impacto en Guatemala que el programa nacional.
Realmente no tuvo un impacto en la respuesta del gobierno en Guatemala, porque el criterio fue estándar. El criterio de decisión para dar la asistencia fue tener bajo consumo de energía eléctrica. Realmente no hubo un filtro que permitiera determinar cuál va a ser. Incluso hubo población urbana, hubo hogares pequeños urbanos de nivel no tan bajo, que por ser hogares pequeños consumen poca energía y también eran elegibles para la asistencia económica. Muchas personas renunciaron voluntariamente a la asistencia porque indicaron que no la necesitaban, porque el criterio era bajo consumo de energía. El problema es también la baja capacidad de respuesta del gobierno para filtrar, identificar de mejor manera a sus beneficiarios y ser más precisos y más focalizados. Realmente no fue una asistencia focalizada, sino una medida estándar de bajo consumo de electricidad. Se asumió como bajo ingreso y por tanto beneficiario de la transferencia monetaria. Eso en el caso de la remesa, pues sí es totalmente dirigido a la familia del trabajador migrante y ellos administran sus recursos. Una relativa ventaja, y la gente de hecho lo ve como una ventaja, es que el gobierno casi no interfiere en su toma de decisiones sobre las remesas, porque disponen de ellas libremente. Lo usan para vivienda, lo usan para salud, para educación. Porque el problema es que como todos los servicios públicos tienen muy bajas coberturas, al final es el gasto privado lo que paga la mayor parte de todos los costos en Guatemala. La salud también se financia principalmente con recursos privados.
Sí, muy interesante. Y yo estoy haciendo mal el trabajo de moderador de seguir las preguntas, la guía de preguntas acá. Déjame volver a las preguntas. Quizá ya discutimos un poquito la primera, pasando, tenemos 10 minutos para otras 4 preguntas acá. Vamos a tener que acelerar un poquito. La pregunta siguiente es cómo la pandemia ha cambiado la vida para ustedes y en qué áreas donde aprendizaje de la pandemia es más relevante. Y creo que eso es tanto para Conrad como para Erick, ¿no, Luis? No es una pregunta solo para, no es una entrevista para...
No, para nada.
Para la gente, ¿no?
Bueno, yo creo
sí.
que somos un grupo tan chiquito, lo más interesante para que pueda salir de esos 10 minutos es un intercambio entre Conrad y Erick de los temas. Entonces,
exacto.
Conrad, any reflections, algunas reflexiones?
Yes, what the pandemic has changed for you, Conrad, and which kind of learnings, areas of learning related to the pandemic?
Are we talking about the research process or what we've learned sort of collectively, maybe as nations or as African nations from the pandemic? That I guess the answer would be a bit different in both cases.
For me, it's like what do we want? What are the lessons learned that have value looking ahead? It's like the pandemic is behind us now, but what do we want to carry forward? Para Erick, ¿cuáles son las lecciones aprendidas que queremos llevar adelante para el próximo crisis? Que estamos de crisis en crisis, hemos aprendido muchísimo. Pero ¿cuáles son los puntos claves que usted diría a un investigador enfrentando el próximo crisis, que sea pandemia, crisis climático, una cosa así? ¿Cómo debemos reaccionar?
Y creo que sí, creo que hacemos esa pregunta de manera amplia, porque creo que muchas de las preguntas ahí que están en el chat son conectadas con eso, ¿no? Entonces, una reflexión más general sobre eso, ¿qué tenemos que aprender para la próxima crisis, básicamente, de tu lado, de tu experiencia, dentro del proyecto principalmente, imagino, ¿no? Pero también de su experiencia durante la pandemia.
Shall I go ahead? So we're in the last phase of the project, but the way we're trying to take it forward is to build a macroeconomic resilience index for 12 African countries. And there are 7 components within that. One looks at the fiscal situation, so deficits, tax and expenditure. Another looks at the external finances. Another one looks at debt. We're looking at human capital, governance. And what we're finding, and it's over a 20-year period, from 2000 to 2022, if we can get the data. And it's so hopefully we'll be able to get some sort of specific, fiscal, monetary, policy suggestions, as well as more about cyclical behavior, but also about the structural growth paths that that countries are on. So, for example, South Africa has had stagnating economy since about 2007. Nigeria has been a lot of African countries have suffered ever since the 2014-15 oil price shock. So some of these trends, kind of slowdowns, are structural in nature, and then the crises hit, and you know, are often some of the countries are not recovering. So the big ones in Africa, South Africa and Nigeria, are not recovering. The younger growing economies like Uganda, Tanzania, Senegal, Togo, they are much less affected. They're able to sort of bounce back quicker. But they also didn't impose the type of lockdowns and fiscal stimulus and debt, additional debt that the slightly better off countries did. Yes, I think part of the answer is, you know, disciplining ourselves during periods of boom times, particularly in revenue. So Nigeria is a fairly extreme case where what I was interested about Guatemala, that something like 10% of GDP is for tax revenue. Now that's roughly what it is in Nigeria as well, but it fluctuates enormously according to the oil price. And over the course of 2020, it dropped from 12% of GDP to 6%. So to try and deal with that kind of volatility is, you know, extraordinary. And the expenditures, your sort of baseline expenditure needs to be targeted to the low points of the oil price or oil price cycle rather than an average or the maximum. So it's what we do during the boom times to build up the reserves and build up the savings that enable us to affect. That's the other side, if you like, of counter-cyclical policy. You know, just as in a recession and a crisis, you want to spend more. So you want to be able to build up your revenues and savings and during the boom times.
That's an important point. One question that I have for you, you mentioned that those countries that had stronger lockdowns and that had bigger deficits because they had more cash transfer programs, let's say larger cash, they are struggling more to recover from the pandemic than the others. That's your general sense. So are you against those policies in the moments of crisis?
No.
That's I guess I'm just trying to take the logic kind of the conclusion from that, right?
I'm guessing we need to be specific about South Africa because it's possible South Africa generates about 30% of its GDP in terms of tax revenue, and it was able to extend a very small grant. I mean, basically, to put it in perspective, it amounts to about $15 to $20 a month per recipient. But that's the food security grant, and it is available to anyone in the informal sector. And when it was threatened to be withdrawn, it prompted widespread looting incidents. So it's become, in a sense, institutionalized. But that's only possible in South Africa. In all the other African countries, the percentage of revenue going to tax is far less. And where it has been spent, it's been on unemployment benefits for those that have already been employed, or otherwise public works programs, which are quite an effective way of, you know, both building infrastructure, but of creating low jobs.
Okay, excellent. No, muy bien, creo que el punto central es cómo pensar ese tema de resiliencia, ¿no? Que tienen factores multidimensionales, estructurales que tienen que ser considerados. I see that you arrived, Amanda, yo vi que llegaste, entonces también gostaríamos de escuchar de ti qué lección, qué punto particular te pareció, tenemos que aprender de esa crisis para la próxima. De tu lado, desde tu experiencia durante la pandemia o del proyecto, ¿cuál es el punto de aprendizaje central?
Oh,
Is it okay? I can do it in English. Amanda, can you hear me?
Sorry, I didn't have the translation on. I mostly got what you said. Was to kind of express my learnings from the pandemic, yes?
Exactly.
muy bien.
Gracias. I will respond in English, obviously, to avoid any embarrassment. It's a slightly different issue, but I think it perhaps builds on Erick's presentation as well. But the question of social protection targeting, and I think something that has really struck me is I didn't realize how bad the data really was in many countries, how old it is, how incomplete it is, and the lack of disaggregation, obviously relevant to today's discussion. And also, so some of the work that we did quite recently looking at, we attempted to, so I work with the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network, who also has been, working on related work through IDS. And we tried to look at positive examples where policies had made a positive impact, at least relative to some of the more challenging cases. And I think there are interesting innovations in social protection, in reaching marginalized groups that came out of the pandemic, some positive things where countries were forced to innovate. Digital technologies having limitations, of course, but still being able to extend really quickly. I think that was my understanding, is that was a factor in South Africa as well. Again, noting the limitations, but a kind of rapid rollout that wouldn't have been possible without the technological innovations. So
Could you give an example of one case where you think that was a great innovation that happened on the data collection for targeting social programs?
I believe Togo. The government of Togo implemented a social protection, a one-off social protection transfer within 1 week of announcing the COVID-19 prevention measures. So they developed the platform and implemented it, and money was in people's hands within a week or something like that, maybe 2 weeks. So that was an interesting one. Another was East Timor, or Timor-Leste, sorry, I should say, where they implemented a universal cash transfer, or near universal. So basically to everyone except for the top earners, for lack of a better word, the top 1%. And there'd been some research done to see how popular that was, and it was found to be very well received by the population. There weren't concerns about ineligible people receiving funds. Universal was popular. And then one more is maybe to take a larger country where there are perhaps more challenges, because those are obviously two smaller populations, is some community participation in targeting in Indonesia. So I understand that around 10 years ago, the government of Indonesia started experimenting with more participatory approaches and community-based approaches to targeting, and using that alongside classic sort of proxy means testing. And they ran, quite a significant research program to observe that, and found that it had slightly more leakage, but higher community buy-in and appreciation for the targeting approach. So those are some of the ones that we noted.
That's excellent. Great examples. Erick, te dejo algunas últimas palabras aí. Tenemos 2 minutos. Creo que las personas ya veo que hay personas ingresando a la sala, pero si tiene alguna reflexión sobre lo que dijo Coyoy de Amanda.
Sí, considero que También es muy importante la focalización, mejorar los mecanismos de focalización en la población realmente más necesitada. Está muy relacionado con la carencia de información, pero también tiene que ver con capacidades para focalizar y con capacidades para hacer uso de la información. Por ejemplo, pongo un ejemplo, en Guatemala se hizo un censo de población en 2018 y el gobierno no hizo uso de este censo. Ahí estaban los hogares, fueron a entrevistar a todos los hogares para hacer el censo de población y vivienda. Sin embargo, el censo no fue usado, tardaron varias semanas en identificar un mecanismo de llegar a toda la población de más bajo ingreso, hasta que encontraron este tema de la energía eléctrica, del bajo consumo de energía eléctrica como una aproximación a un indicador de bajo ingreso, pero esa capacidad de los gobiernos de procesar información también es fundamental, no solo la disponibilidad, sino procesarla y saberla aplicar para definir mecanismos de focalización apropiados. Creo que eso es clave también.
Muy bien, excelente. Creo que así seamos nuestro grupo. Yo veo que hay más gente llegando, así te paso la palabra, Luis. Gracias.
Gracias. Creo que estamos en el último minuto, pero creo que el papel del moderador es ser la persona que se corte en mitad de la oración, que no sea uno de los panelistas.
Exacto, exacto. No quiero dejar toda la gente hablando a la mitad del camino.
Bueno, gracias. Ha sido un grupo pequeño pero enfocado. Gracias para tus intervenciones. Espero que les ha sido útil. Uno de los grandes objetivos fue compartir experiencias. Oh, okay, and everyone's coming back now. I've got to switch languages back. I forgot we were not getting cut off because we've been in the main room. Okay, that's why we weren't getting the countdown. Great. Welcome back, everyone. We'll just give it a few more moments as people are flying through cyberspace between their breakout group and the plenary. Okay, so we are very short of time. So we have a chance now for feedback from the breakout groups, but I think I'm going to pass over to my colleague Jess, who has been in group 2, and to share your feedback. And do you want to share with the word cloud, or are you going to do that afterwards?
I'll do that after we've heard from each group.
Okay, and sorry.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay, come in.
Brief. We had a really great chat actually, and it was quite a lot of questions for Aditi on the ICRW work. And I just wanted to say I'm really sorry to Josephine, who asked a question right at the end and then got unceremoniously cut off. But we're happy to link you guys up behind the scenes if that's helpful, to talk about methodologies. So our group, we talked a bit about some of the methodological challenges on collecting data, particularly on sensitive topics. So a lot of the people in our group had worked on studies around women and violence against women, and saying, actually, how do you reliably capture that data when it's often very sensitive and stigmatized to talk about? And that kind of linked in also into this issue of like, this happened so quickly, there wasn't really a lot of time to think about how to develop these qualitative surveys, to capture all of the information in the right way, especially when you're doing it remotely and you're not there in person, you're not building that natural rapport. So what can we learn about future sort of ideas for different methodologies for how to capture more reliable data on sensitive subjects, particularly for women? The importance of good governance. So thinking about how it's really highlighted, you know, what we knew already, but good governance is so important. And the fact that during COVID, there was some authoritarian governments that didn't perform so well. And there was a bit of a cynical use of governments around citizen rights in the sort of COVID response policies. Thinking about data, there was a lot of talk about data and how data is so crucial, and data-driven policy making is essential going forward. Thinking about the importance of grassroots organizations, and this came up in a lot of the presentations today, but really grassroots organizations driving that research for future, and how at the moment the flows of funding aren't really mirroring what we know about the importance of those organizations. So how we might tackle that disconnect. And then thinking about how we take this forward and keep momentum. We heard a bit from a couple of participants about how some of the civic spaces that sort of opened up a bit during COVID are actually closing back down again, or have been for some time. And how do we really keep the momentum going forward? And Catherine came in and said, it's really talking in this People's Agenda about pandemic preparedness, thinking about a really interconnected and interdisciplinary approach. Gosh, say that after a few beers, that would be a tricky one. So yeah, really thinking about different disciplines and interconnectedness. But James or anyone in my group, if there's anything key that I missed, please do come in and add.
Great, thanks for that, Jess. Very quick and insightful, sort of 3 key points. So if I could pass over to Kundan, who I believe was in group 1.
Yes, thank you very much. I think in group 1, collaborative governance as such kind of appeared to be a key area of interest. Around collaborative governance, there were many questions around what contexts actually make it successful, what are the chances that it leads to a parallel form of governance, and how does state engage with that? What is the role of private sector when it comes to collaborative governance, and the role of technology in collaborative governance processes. There were a lot of questions around how do we ensure transparency and accountability in such processes, and what kind of mechanisms can CSOs or NGOs rely on, and how does it function in places where state apparatus is not as strong? Regulations around CSOs or NGOs may not be very strong. What may it look like there? And for a future research agenda, a key thing that stuck to my mind was around representation, question of representation of informal workers, because that has a longer time horizon and can be very vital in securing enough relief, enough response during such emergencies, and everything else around that. So these were the key highlights from the lively discussion in my group. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Kundan. And then finally, Fernando, over to you for the group 3.
Yeah, and the group 3 was truly bilingual. So are my notes. So I'm gonna try to do it in English, but my notes are in Spanish. So let's see how this is gonna go. If first start with a focus on fiscal capacity of different governments to build social programs, and especially the case of Guatemala was an interesting one, because we see that the government has 10% of GDP in terms of their incomes, where remittances are 20% of the GDP. So I think that's a big kind of when they could increase a bit their fiscal capacity to put some money into the social programs, remittances was such a much larger part of the money in the Guatemalan context, that actually we were just discussing and figuring out that actually, of course, the policies in the United States in relation to cash flows were more impactful in Guatemala than probably the policies that the government in the country had, and this creates some of course distortions on where the money goes and the equality of those things. So and it connects, I think, with the other. So I think one key point there is also the issue of understanding the broader resilience of different countries that needs to consider fiscal, the debt, the human capital, and all the different dimensions. Like in order to build, I think that's the second big point, is related to the kind of how to build that resilience in terms of all these different dimensions, the structural elements of that, so that basically we don't have situations where governments try to do a lot, maybe more than they can in terms of the fiscal action, etc., in terms of the programs, and then that creates actually a burden that they are not have been able. Some places have not been able to come up as fast from the crisis, and because they are now trapped in that crisis as well. So I think that that's kind of how the governments can balance this kind of resilience, and actually how they can build on the good days, of course, to save for the bad days. But I think that the practicality of those things is much trickier for sure. Which means it goes to the third point that I think is that was more how for social protection to work, it needs to be super targeted. It needs to be well designed and targeted, and having good quality data is important. The case of Guatemala, Erick was mentioned, was like just based on low consumption of energy is not really a good. It can be a general proxy for poverty, but it's definitely not a good data for targeting social protection programs, because you have too much error at the individual level, of course, and you need to have broader systems. So Amanda brought a lot of the different experiences as well in other places where these work better, like in Togo, with they at least having a quick platform there, moving to the general population in East Timor, cash transfer programs, in like how they engage communities in the design of social programs in Indonesia, etc. So I think that these issues were super important. And actually, even in the case of Guatemala, Erick was mentioning that we had they had just a recent census. No, they could have used even the census data to do some of that work. And at the end, it's just like the lack of use of that good data that was available, that could be made it more effective for us targeting social protection programs. So I think that was the highlights of our discussion.
Great, thank you for that, Fernando. Okay, so we have sort of just under 15 minutes remaining, but I know that Jess is itching to share the beautiful word cloud with you that sort of has been our collective attempt to synthesize what we've been hearing today. So a bit of a drum roll. Oh wow, that is beautiful. And yeah, do you want to talk to it? Would you like me to talk to it? Would like?
I think you were going to, but I can.
No, I'm happy to have a look at this. So obviously, clearly, this question of access, which is great, access, collaboration, and intersection, sitting at the center. Obviously, a strong area around gender. I think we will sort of capture this and share it as a sort of summary of our discussion today. Lots on there that I can't dig into with 10 minutes remaining, because I really want to make sure that there is a chance for anyone to jump in with any sort of burning reflections, questions to the group, sort of thoughts in terms of how we take this agenda forward, potential sort of opportunities, synergies that you've identified with your work with the panelists today. We don't no hands. All right, well, I'm going to start sort of picking out a few things in here. In that case, I have been attempting in my role as the moderator, and please, we do have 10 minutes, so please feel free to jump in at any point. Because I think for me, one of the things what's really been interesting about the conversation today is the dynamic of really thinking about informality, what's happening at the grassroots within civil society, the civic spaces on the one hand, and really understanding the effects of the pandemic within those socioeconomic groupings. And then on the other hand, the social programming, the more formal responses, and how those are able to link together. And I think, you know, looking at this word cloud, the big green access intersection are sort of really, really key here. A word that has come up over and over again has been targeting. And I think this sort of it sort of bridges between really the understanding who these grassroots organizations are. We've heard from the experience both from India and Guatemala, really important examples of sort of the challenges of creating visibility for different grassroots groups in terms of the need for ID cards, sort of targeting around access to electricity, which by its very nature sort of cuts out the most marginalized. And so how to create access for these grassroots groups in the space of the pandemic and ensure their access to services. I think one of the other key themes that has come out for me from across these conversations, I think it's sort of it's hidden in the word cloud, but is the issue of data. We've talked a lot about, you know, having the data to identify these people, these different groups, issues around the disaggregation, how we access sort of the qualitative data, real challenges of sort of the disconnect in systems. You know, the pandemic, it happened so fast, and we were you know, caught off guard. We didn't have time to prepare. And I think this is a real key point of this webinar as the first in the webinar series of like really making sure that we capture the learning and move ahead. And I'm delighted to see that people are sort of now adding again more into the word cloud. Keep going. It's keeping me on my toes as it's jumping around. And then the other sort of area of this space, this big green sort of collaboration around good governance, the importance of sort of creating this connect between the grassroots, the civic spaces, and the local government level, looking at collaboration and then within the civic space, but then also linking that up to the formal space, and thinking, you know, how to sort of mobilize and access those fiscal resources, as we heard around, you know, the example of Guatemala, some of the challenges around the fiscal capacity, the formal versus the informal economy, you know, and then comparing that with the example that's come through from Collaboralat of like the real added value of creating those spaces where local government is working hand in hand with sort of community organizations, and the more that those spaces can be formalized and interact with that fiscal space and provide access to services, support, social assistance programs. I think that's and then I think then the final piece is sort of looking ahead. What do we take away from this? I think for me, this sort of the localization agenda, you know, that hopefully one of the positives that has come out of COVID is this this sort of push to understand the importance of creative and localized solutions, access to services, collaboration across different levels, creating visibility of different groups, to sort of build targeted and contextualized social support programs. Still no hands. But I can see stuff is happening in the chat, which I would just sort of engage with. I don't know whether the chat is. Any final points? I'm just I wonder if anyone from IDRC would just like to come in for a last close. But before I sort of do that, I would just like to say this is the first in a series of 3 webinars. So we are going to be back, not in precisely this space, but back on Zoom on Tuesday for a webinar where we will be sort of launching the key issues guide, and discussing with our core panelists on fiscal. And then next Thursday, a week from now, we will have the final in the series, exploring food systems. Is there anything that I have forgotten, or my chat box has disappeared? Anyone from else would like to come in? I'm being reminded to ask you to register for those events. The link has just been put in the chat, and Adrian has put his hand up. So over to you, Adrian, for some final reflections from you.
Thank you. And that was in answer to your request to call for some final words from IDRC. It's nothing too deep in terms of reflection, more just a profound and a thank you to everyone, and especially to our research partners in regions around the world. It's remarkable we are where we are now 3 years later, both in terms of what we all lived through, but from our perspective, just to assure everyone, we had this recognition all along that we were possibly making huge and unrealistic demands to people to prepare proposals, to get research up and running in a virtual environment, or reaching out into the world when we didn't know how safe it was or not. There's been huge shifts. I don't think anyone has fully, on an individual or collective level, truly come to grips with what we've lived through. It's one of these transformational life moments that we'll be talking about for a while. But just to see the quality of all the work that's come out, but also the importance, the timeliness, all the efforts to ensure the way we love to see that you've been able to take the findings and get it to the right audience at the right moments in the right ways. It's remarkable. And I still feel like we're just catching our breath on everything. And so thank you for the discussion today, for all the collaboration throughout. Stay tuned for more in terms of the other 2 sessions next week and beyond. It really is the importance of research and having people in societies grappling with problems. That's what we're here for, and we hope to be around to confront all challenges, big and small, in coming years.
Great, thank you for that, Adrian. And I can see that there is some knowledge exchange happening in the chat, Amanda and Hilani, and that's what we like to see, sort of the sort of heart and soul of our work in the KT support function to the core program. So you do have links in the chat to the 2 upcoming webinars in this series. Huge thank you to the panelists today. It's always a huge task to try to summarize 2 years of really intense research in 8 minutes. So you all did a brilliant job. And thank you also to everyone who's made the time to join us here today. As we move out of pandemic mode, it's sort of getting harder and harder to find time for these sort of, one of the great outcomes of the pandemic has been the facility which we do come together on a global scale in these little boxes. So thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to the translators, and we hope to see many of you back here on Tuesday.